Hello
Hello,
there.
shalom.
Shalom. How are y'all doing
Hope y'all are
today?
doing well today.
Today is day 16 or day 2 of week 3. Is that right? Of the counting of the Omer. So let's say the blessing together. Baruch
Baruch
atah
atah
Adonai,
Adonai,
Eloheinu
Eloheinu
melech
melech
haolam,
haolam,
asher
asher
kitshanu
kitshanu
b'mitzvotav,
b'mitzvotav,
v'tzivanu
v'tzivanu
al
al
separat
separat
ha'omer.
ha'omer.
And blessed
Blessed
are
are
you,
you,
O
O
Lord
Lord
our
our
God,
God,
King
King
of
of
the
the universe,
universe, who
who
has
has
sanctified
sanctified
us
us
by
by
his
his
commandments,
commandments and
commanded
commanded
us
us
about
about
the
the counting
counting
of
of the
the
Omer.
Omer. Amen. So we are on day 16.
Yes, we are.
All right.
And based off of previous discussions, we're going to kick off with Romans chapter 11
Yes.
and that idea of being grafted in. You know, he starts off that chapter by saying, you know, God has not rejected his people, has he? And the answer to that is
May it never be.
absolutely not. And that's so much of where some of our confusion in the modern world comes in. You know, we talked about the expansion of the tent, the adding of the Gentiles to what God was doing through the Jewish people.
Right.
That being His plan, His method, His intent all along. As far as the gospel, that was the gospel that was shown to Abraham all the way back in Genesis, that Paul talks about in Galatians 2 and 3. You know, where he saw that gospel, that mystery of Jew and Gentile coming together. And so
Yes.
we're going to be starting out in verse 16 of Romans 11 and talking about how we as Gentiles, you know, in being added to the tent, don't take over the tent.
Correct.
We don't take over. We are added to the family, and we are grafted in. That's kind
Because
of
technically it's not our tent.
no. It's His tent
It's his
first
tent.
and foremost,
Absolutely.
and He has natural-born children that are under His household, and He has adopted children that are in His household. And both of them live by the rules and the pattern that is set by the Father. So, Romans, were you looking up something?
Well, I was trying to find that part where it talks about the significance of being Jewish, right?
Okay.
I was thinking it was in Romans 9, but I'm having a hard time finding it at the moment. Do you see it?
I know which one you're talking about.
Right.
I think.
Hold on a second. It just popped in my brain.
Romans chapter 9,
Yes.
verse 3.
Okay.
Well, he talks about, I would pray that I myself were cursed and banished from Messiah for the sake of my people, my own flesh and blood, who are Israelites. It says, to them belong the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the Torah and the temple service and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and from them, according to the flesh, the Messiah, who is over all, God, blessed forever. Amen. That's the one you were looking for?
That's the one I was looking for. So, because you mentioned adoption, and adoption is, first of all, theirs.
Yes. They are the firstborn.
Yes. Okay, so I just wanted to show that, we're not trying to ignore that fact that technically the word adopted is also used for them. So we're not trying to ignore that. So let's continue with Romans 11.
All right. So 11:16 says, if the first fruit is holy, so is the whole batch of dough, and if the root is holy, so are the branches.
Stop. What's the first part here? What's the first fruits? What's the root?
If the root is holy, well, Yeshua talk about being the vine?
He's the vine.
And we are the branches?
But that's on a vine. This is an olive tree. So what is the root of the olive tree? If the olive tree is Israel, what is the root of that olive tree? Is it not the patriarchs? Were they not holy in a sense? So they were called and set apart, right? So yeah, Genesis never refers to them as holy, but they are definitely called and set apart for that purpose. Okay, so if they're holy, if they're set apart, then the whole loaf is holy. Okay? If the root is holy, then so are the branches. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So first fruits being dedicated as holy.
So you might say the patriarch are the first fruits of the first fruit.
Mm-hmm. Verse 17, but if some of the branches were broken off, so does that happen? Are there some branches that are broken off? Yes, based on what? Based on unbelief, based on rejection.
And it tells us that.
Yeah, it tells us that. If some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive, so the wild olive in this case is the Gentile. And were grafted in among them, and became, so this wild olive became a partaker of the root of the olive tree with its richness.
So became part of the patriarchs, became part of
the family.
That family, that tree. We've come into the tent of Abraham, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
So we as Gentiles become partakers of the root of the olive tree with its richness. Do not boast against the branches. And don't think more highly of yourself than you should. Look how great I am.
Those branches, don't brag about your status over the branches that are actually supposed to be there.
Yeah.
Right? We're the ones grafted in, not them.
And don't think or boast about your position to the branches that are still remain.
That's yes.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah. I'm talking about that because obviously we're going to get to a point in a minute where they're grafted back in if they've rejected. So, but yes, those that have stayed, those that have remained, those that are native to that tree. You think of the first century Jewish believers, and all of a sudden they're being outnumbered by these Gentile believers, and all of a sudden these Gentile believers start making decisions that push away anything Jewish. Well, then what are they doing?
They're rejecting the root
and the native
and the native branches.
The native branches. Does that work? Can the tree reject itself?
No.
Okay, so.
But do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, it is not you who support the root, but the root supports you. Mm-hmm. So you are becoming a part of something bigger and more than you. It's not about you at that point. It's not about us.
It's not about you. Right.
But if you do boast, it is not you who support the root, but the root supports you. Yes. Verse 19, you will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. And Paul says that's true. That's true enough. Mm-hmm. All right, they were broken off. Yeah. That does happen. And it says they were broken off because of unbelief.
And that was happening in the first century.
Yes, because they were rejecting Yeshua as the Messiah. Mm-hmm. So they were rejecting the fulfillment of those promises that were made.
Yes.
And so they were broken off so that I might be grafted in. True enough, they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but fear. Right? Do not be arrogant. That's one of the most important things for us as Gentiles to understand in coming to this faith, is we cannot be arrogant thinking that we suddenly are the be-all, end-all, that we know everything and that we control everything and dictate everything. Now that we're here, we're in charge, and now the party really gets started.
Right.
I mean, that's not really how it's supposed to work.
It's not how it works. Biblically speaking, it's not how it works.
No, it's not how it works. So, you stand by faith. Don't be arrogant, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. All right, so we can be, there's those parables that he talks about the soils. Mm-hmm. And when the seed it's planted out there on the road, in among the rocks, in the different various places, right? And sometimes that seed even takes root, But when the hardship, the thorns among the thorns, and when the hardships and difficulties come, those weeds choke out the what's been sown, and it becomes unfruitful, right? Or things die off because of the scorching sun, all right? This is not supposed to be a flash of the pan moment where, hey, we're here, and it's got to be an entire lifetime. Once you're committed to this is who you are. And you're becoming part of something that existed before you got here.
Much bigger than you.
And it's bigger than you. So you are being changed and adapted into something that's already existing. That's what this is really supposed to be saying. You're not coming in to try to replant the old tree and take over.
And this is the importance of taking a hold of a tzitzit of a believing Jew, right? Because we're being grafted in to this tree of believers, those who believe. Even Abraham believed. One of I think it's the Targum Jonathan. I'm thinking that's the Targum it's in, that talked about in Genesis 15 that Abraham believed in the Word, of course, right? And the Word, of course, is Yeshua, is the Messiah. So we're being grafted in this tree of believers. And so when we take a hold of the tzitzit, so to speak, of an unbelieving Jew, we're actually taking hold of the tzitzit of someone who's been broken off. Someone who can be very naturally grafted back in, but for the time being, they've been broken off.
Mm-hmm. That's the interesting thing about the analogy of the cultivated and the wild.
Yes.
As soon as the gardener goes out into the wild and cuts off some of the branches off the wild olive branch and brings it back into his orchard, into his vineyard, so to speak, we're no longer wild at that point, are we? He has been cultivating us. He has been adapting us to that situation.
We're all being made into the sukkah,
mm-hmm.
into the dwelling place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that the idea of being made into the sukkah, both cultivated and wild, you see in the book of Nehemiah in I think it's chapter 8, where it talks about all of a sudden they realize they're reading in the Torah and they realize, wait a minute, it's this time of year and we're supposed to be making booths or sukkahs for ourselves
mm-hmm.
because it's time for the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot. And so they go out and they find all the branches they're supposed to have for their lulavs, they get their etrog, they do all these things, but along with the branches that they're told to get, the myrtle and the palm and the willow, the leafy, then they also collect the cultivated and wild olive tree branches.
That's very nice.
And it's specifically mentioned that way as, olive branches and wild olive branches. So this was always part of the plan. We were always supposed to be part of the sukkah, part of the dwelling
mm-hmm.
place. Okay?
So he goes on, he says, if he did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. And that's to lower our level of arrogance and boasting. Notice then the kindness and severity of God. Severity toward those who fell. But God's kindness toward you, if you continue in his kindness, if you abide mm-hmm. in him. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. Amen. For God is able to graft them in again. So even though somebody may reject Messiah at first glance, so to speak, mm-hmm. The end of their life may come along and they may choose to believe.
You may not be the end of that process in terms of them coming to faith, but you may be the one just planting the seed mm-hmm. or doing some watering. So we can't take,
we can't pronounce a judgment on where somebody's going to finish.
Right.
It's
a matter of how you finish, right?
Yeah. I remember even in traditional church life, they would say it takes someone hearing the gospel, quote unquote, something like 30 times before they will respond by faith. So again, we don't know exactly where somebody is, but we know that that's a decision that is ultimately up to him. He knows where a person is. He knows the decisions that they've made, and he knows whether someone is believing or not.
Right. And I point to that. It's important to where we finish. So many of us look back on our salvation experience and think, oh, I'm good. Are you? Because what life have you been living since then? Right? It's not where you start, it's where you finish. And the book of Ezekiel is very clear about that. It's very clear about that. So that might be Ezekiel 28. So it's very important that we keep in mind that this is a long distance race. This isn't a sprint, right? For most of us, it's not just 100-yard dash, but it's a long marathon. It is a lifetime, and we are supposed to finish well. Finish well. Finish in faith. You hear these stories about people who believed, and then all of a sudden, deep into their faith, they decide to turn their back on God and reject Him. They're not finishing well. Right? So that is a very important biblical concept. Okay?
So, God is able to graft them in again, and the anticipation is that He is going to, that there is going to be a day when He does.
Exactly.
And in many ways, we are living in times where that's happening more and more.
Yes, we are.
And that's an exciting thing, though. Those are days of fulfillment.
Yes.
When what has been cut off starts getting brought back.
And what's interesting about this whole thing, yes, we're being grafted in. So we're being made part of the tree. We're being made part of the bride. Right? You okay?
Yeah. Just yawning.
He was like, what's going on with him? So anyway, we're being made part of the bride. But the truth of the matter is we need each other. Because a lot of times when they're grafted back in, they're grafted onto us. The wild. Right? If they come through to faith through a Gentile, they're being grafted back on to their tree through that Gentile. And the same sap goes through all of it. Goes through the root, goes through the trunk, goes through the first branches up into us, and then back into them. So, we need each other. And Romans 11 shows that. If you go back in the chapter, right? If you go back in the chapter to verse 12, it says, moreover, if someone who is Jewish, someone who is native to that tree, okay, if their stumbling, their rejection of Messiah, is bringing riches to the world, that is, if Israel being placed temporarily in a condition less favorable than that of the Gentiles, not because God has rejected the Jewish people, but because these individuals have rejected Messiah, okay? His ultimate ambassador, the one whom He sent from heaven, right? So they've rejected Him, and that has brought riches to us Gentiles, right? How much greater riches will Israel in their fullness bring? So when they stop rejecting Him and they believe, the richness they bring back into us is absolutely incredible. And we're living in the fulfillment of this. We are living in these days. They're coming back into faith in Messiah. And with that, the riches that they're bringing of the things that the Jewish people have held on to for years, even though they didn't understand it was about Messiah, they're bringing into the faith of Messiah, and it's adding so much richness to our faith in Messiah. So when we go in this direction in terms of being more messianic, understanding that the Torah is still relevant in the life of the believer, when we go in this direction, our faith should deepen. Our faith should become more rich in Messiah. If we're rejecting Messiah when we come in this direction, as you often say, we're doing it wrong.
Yeah. And for example, richness that is brought in, was my own experience in first time hearing the symbolism of Passover.
Right.
That added a great depth and richness and a desire and hunger for more that I had been missing out on. And I got to share just last week with some pastors, local pastors, some of the things that we've learned, in coming this direction and in studying things like in the Septuagint or looking at the Aramaic translations of the Tanakh, what's called the Targums, and how understanding how the Jewish people translated these things or understood certain concepts has just added a depth and a greater appreciation for Messiah, who he is and what he has done. It's not diminished him at all. He's actually increased in all of those things. But back in verse 24, he's able to graft them in again. He says, "For if you were cut out of that which by nature is a wild olive tree, and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree," so you've gone from being wild to being cultivated, right? So cultivated is that they now are living and operating and functioning by the determination of the gardener and his way of life and rules, right? He prunes those things that aren't producing fruit. He expects it to live and grow and work a certain way.
They're healthy.
They're
getting the sap from the roots, right? They're living the life of the patriarch, so to speak.
Yeah, if he can take you as a wild olive branch and stick you onto a cultivated olive tree, he says, how much more will these natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? I mean, he had to move heaven and earth to make it possible for us Gentiles to be saved and be included. And so it's
their olive tree. He makes that point again, into their own olive tree, right? So when a Jewish person comes to faith in Yeshua, they're being grafted back into their own olive tree. Everything for them fits. Everything for them falls in place. Everything for them that they've been doing their whole lives that they could do rote, without even thinking, because they've been doing it all their lives. All of a sudden, it makes more sense than ever.
Things that we haven't been doing all our lives,
that we have to learn how to do.
We'll start learning to do, because now we've gone from being wild to being cultivated. Let's end there for today, so we can maybe talk about the rest of it tomorrow. You think?
I think we can do that. That sounds good. Because there's more, and there's even more that we're going to go back and grab a little bit more of. Yeah. So
it's not like we only have. Let's see. Today is day 16. So we've got a few of these days left. So we can't cover it all in one day.
No.
But with that, thank y'all for joining us. May the Father truly bless y'all in this time of the counting of the Omer.
Amen. Shalom,
shalom.